Welcome to the NT podcast. My name is Nemanja Jurisic, and today we have a very special guest joining us all the way from the Philippines, Dr. Kenneth Bergland, professor of Old Testament and one of the leading voices in current research on the composition of the Pentateuch. Professor Bergland, welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm doing good.
Okay, so my throat hurts a little bit. I have a cold, but we will manage this. So thank you for coming to my channel. And today we will be exploring the idea of constructing a positive model of how the Pentateuch came into being, a fresh perspective that focuses not on criticizing all older theories, but on understanding how the Torah actually took shape and developed over time. So my first question, Professor Bergland, how did you come up with the idea of studying the composition of the Pentateuch? What is the background and what led you to investigate this question?
Yeah, of course it is sort of a life story also. I studied, I think in a way that my interest started somewhat when I was studying at Hebrew University in Israel. With Baruch Schwartz, on the documentary hypothesis. And sitting in his class, of course, he has good points, and still I wasn't entirely convinced that the source critical solution was the only possible and even the best. So I think it sort of started there. Afterward, I worked somewhat as a pastor. I've been working as a pastor and a youth pastor. And I was discussing, especially with one young student, was struggling with the question of the composition also. So it added this sort of pastoral dimension to the study. There are real people, struggling with this. And as I got more into it, also I saw that many of scholars, and maybe critical scholars, interestingly have maybe a faith background. So they grew up in faith homes. And then when they came to universities, they encountered a lot of theories and didn't find better solutions than the critical solutions. So in a way, they ended, some of them leaving the faith background or in a way modifying it. And to me, it was also this interest in a way, can we give better answers that can be a real help to people that are asking honest questions about this. And then I think the final stage where it came to shape was in a class with Roy Gain at Andrews. We were studying Ugaritic, and then we're just noticing very similar phenomena in these texts as and people or scholars are not questioning the sources in these texts, but immediately when we see the same phenomena in the Pentateuch, it has to be different sources. And then the question was, well, why not explore this more? And from there, it basically took off. So.
Yes, I had Professor Roy Kane on my channel, and he told me a bit of story about class, but I didn't know about the rest. So amazing. And second thing, the fourth ECP conference was recently held. So what were the impressions, and are there any new plans, conclusions, anything?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's nice to see that in a way we have a quite stable group. In way, some of the people that were at the core of the project in the first conference, they are still with us and in a way still very committed. So the group, of course, has grown. So now we are over 30 scholars involved in the ECP or exploring the composition of the Pentateuch. So in a way, it was a confirmation about the vitality of the project. People still are curious and want to explore more. Because in this fourth conference, our focus was upon some of the key passages in the discussion of the composition. So where there are controversies in scholarship, So because in a way you can create a lot of theories and discuss theories back and forth, but it really comes down to, in a way, close reading of individual texts also, which reading actually works the best. So in this fourth conference, that was basically what we were exploring, in a way, identifying the key passages. And then we had different scholars working on each of them, and in a way testing out the readings. And in a way, is the approach we are taking, are we still convinced that that is the better when we weigh the evidence? So, of course, in a way, this will also result in the fifth volume coming out now from, or sort of it would be the sixth volume coming out from the ECP project. So in a way, that's at least a concrete result from the conference. And we did decide to meet again. So if God willing, we'll meet in 2 years again to continue discussing different areas.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Kenneth. So many people criticize the documentary hypothesis, but you take a different approach by constructing a positive model of how the Pentateuch came into being rather than merely offering critique. So what can you tell us about that model? Which theory do you support, and what is the general consensus and key points of agreement among those 30 scholars that you mentioned involved in the ECP project regarding the dating and authorship of the Torah?
No. Well, maybe we could say that we are more interested in the text than in the theory. So, again, you can discuss back and forth theories, but it comes down to how you actually read the text and relate to the text. Yes, it has been a lot of controversy, and there are a lot of discussions now on the composition of the Pentateuch. And it is also, and this is not just sort of something we are observing, but with this volume that was it 2016? It was published on the formation of the Pentateuch, the fat 111 volume, or FAT. But it was fat, it was thick. There, the editors start saying that it is really just a crisis in Pentateuch scholarship. You have the traditions in the US, in Europe, and Israel, and communication has almost broken down because you come from a very theoretical position, and you have very specific definition of a word. So when a scholar in a European setting uses this, it means something completely different in an American or Israeli context. And of course, this is a challenge in scholarship and sort of the academic discourse as well. So I think in a way, motivation in our project also is that we should really go beyond just criticizing the positions of others. It's a more demanding sort of approach is to say, well, if you're not happy with other approaches, you actually have to come up with something better. And so that's the challenge in a way we've given ourselves, that we want to move toward a positive model. And I think we still would include the toward because we're not claiming that we have a final complete model that answers every question, and maybe I think we're realizing that we might never get there, but we are moving toward it, and at least being able to present more consistent readings of the text that are more sensitive to the literary environment in which they were composed. I think you asked about, in a way, well, consensus in the group, in the ECP group. And I think sort of one of the basic points that we have consensus about is that we really need to start with the text as it is. You cannot start with a compositional theory about the text. because then you basically set the stage already. You determine your reading. So take the text as it is. We don't have earlier sources or fragments of the text available. It is basically in the form we have it as a complete text. And that is the basis from where research needs to start. Of course, also acknowledging the importance of comparative studies. But in a way, it has been this assumption in much earlier comparative study that whenever you find parallels between the Bible and extra-biblical material, it's always the Bible that is the borrowing part. And in ways, simplistic models, if you like, about in a way the relationship between literary and cultural parallels. So I think it is good that comparative studies in recent years have become more cautious. Yes, you need to notice similarities, but also differences. The differences are just as important as the similarities. And in a way, holding back on creating large theories about influence in the ancient Near East when we have fragmented evidence for it. So I think in a way that's also something we have sort of consensus around, and we're moving more in that direction, but still acknowledging the importance of empirical models as a test for our theories. Also, diachronic linguistics is central, and the importance of diachronic linguistics. Many Pentateuchal scholars tend to almost just ignore the findings in diachronic linguistics because it's showing a layer of the development of the language. And if you opt for a post-exilic dating of the Pentateuch, it doesn't fit very well with the theory that you're finding different stages of Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible and the Pentateuch belonging to a specific segment, because you would expect that all the Hebrew you find is similar. So in acknowledging the importance of diachronic linguistics, of course I can go on. I'm not sure how much you want to know, but one area I've been interested in, and I think in a way we've been discussing lately also, is this idea of literary coherence. Because if you like a traditional approach, argues that the entire Pentateuch is a coherent text. This is something, a literary ideal we very much inherited from Aristotle. He defined it sort of: a text has to be coherent. It should not have redundancy. And so whenever that is present, it signals a problem in the text. And so source critics, of course, have tried to solve that, but by creating sub-coherent texts or sources, if like that, they claim to be coherent within themselves. The problem is they are neither coherent according to our standards of coherence. So you end in this endless parting up of the text until you just have a lot of fragments and a lot of speculation that really doesn't have very much solid foundation. So yeah, maybe, of course, just mention one other area that I've been working with is in a literary reuse. And at least in my studies, I find that the Pentateuch consistently is the earlier layer of in the Hebrew Bible. Just as in diachronic linguistics, the Pentateuch belongs to classical biblical Hebrew. We have scholars arguing that it belongs to the early stage of classical biblical Hebrew. And also with literary reuse, I think we find that the Pentateuch stands sort of as the fountainhead, the source of the following books, and all of them relate to the Pentateuch. And of course, that is indicating also dating. It is the earliest stage of the Hebrew Bible. So yeah, I think that's sort of some points where we have a consensus as a group, and the model in which we are working around.
Right. So thank you so much. And it's not that easy that either Moses wrote it as a whole or there are four sources. There is a room for thinking about middle grounds and other things. Would you say like that? And would you say that maybe Ezra is a final redactor? Many people believe that. So
Yeah, I think in a way it is evidence of later reductional stages. So Genesis 36, for example, mentions that in the days there were still no kings in Israel. And that, of course, would be odd to write centuries before the monarchic period. So, and of course, obviously, the death of Moses, in a way, has to be later. So clearly, there is evidence of post-Mosaica, as it's called, but also it is limited. How much it is not the hardcore evidence is quite marginal. Then, of course, scholars have dealt very much with the themes and the content of the Pentateuch, and use that to date. So if they find tensions between sort of, for example, priestly material and more ethical material, they see that as reflecting a discussion between different groups of people. I think Benjamin Sommer, he wrote a very nice article about pseudo-historicism, and using themes to date the text to periods that you find these themes to be the most sort of to align the best with. And I think it's a very sort of weak foundation for dating texts. We need more solid, more objective sort of data from which to date it. So I don't have a problem with the idea that there were later polishing and compiling of material. But I think still that when you read the text at face value, it presents itself, at least as from the time of Moses, as a pre-monarchic, even pre-settlement sort of source. So to me, the interesting question, or the most interesting question, is not when do we find the latest possible evidence of a redactional hand on the text, but the dominant profile of the text, where does that belong historically? And I think that's the crucial question when you come to the question of the dating of the Pentateuch. So yes, later, sort of editing and polishing, but the text, I think there are several arguments for saying in a way that the text, the base of the text as we have it, is really early and it is pre-monarchic.
Yes, it makes sense. So what would you say about theory? I think Chaim Rabin, that's a scholar that pointed out that the language of the Torah is earlier than 9th century, certainly, because if we compare stories like Elijah, Elisha, etc., it's similar like Torah. But if it is later, then yeah, it looks like that's not the case. So we have Gary Ransburg and Benjamin Kilgore, Daniel Block. They would say that okay, there were autographs from the Moses, But somebody in the Jerusalem in the time of David and Solomon wrote and collected all those traditions and texts. So that's the time when it's written. So what do you think?
Yeah, and in our group, at least, sort of, we have different views on that. And in a way we have room for different views on it. When you mention the issue of diachronic linguistics and dating of the Pentateuch, so more recently you have scholars like Yoel Elitzer, Aaron Horncall at Oxford, Elitzer in Israel. That I think in which show they have good arguments for showing that the Pentateuch is revealing an earlier stage than even the book of Judges, Samuel, Joshua. So there are sort of linguistic elements that are either present there that disappear in later texts, or only occur at later stages. So it is a different profile, but of course, it is important to be moderate as well and not exaggerate the evidence. So there is evidence, and then the question is, how do you interpret it? And I'm not a linguist, so I leave in a way the more detailed discussion to the experts, but I do acknowledge or hear that they are discussing in a way, is this just an early monarchic Hebrew? Or some would say that no, actually, the differences we see in the prose material could actually reflect the time span that the text itself claims to have. So it is possible that the Hebrew goes back. I was trained in a view seeing the Hebrew as having been updated at a later stage. So of course that's one option. So you had an early stage of the Hebrew, it was updated. But yeah, I think in a way this is one of the areas that are being studied more these days and need more studies in a way to see exactly where is it leading us. So.
Yes, I like it. So you wouldn't say certainly that somebody is heretic if accept this theory or another. So is it legitimate to believe in this theory as a Adventist, let's say?
Yeah, at least sort of academically, we wouldn't speak of heretics. It's just different opinions. But of course, in a way, when you come to the question of a faith and a faith position, I think it is crucial what position you take. Sort of is when the text claims something about yourself, do you actually believe it or not? Or do you see this as pseudonymous writing, and I think that makes major difference in a way in a faith position how you read it, and faith, how to put it, in biblical studies we all have faith. If you believe in a more traditional sort of model or a critical, it is a certain faith choice. You trust one more than another. So I don't think the question is really faith or not faith, but what do you believe in? And but the challenge is when our faith turns into dogmatism, and in a way where our position, in a way we begin excluding counter arguments, and even in a way just see our task as getting into the trenches and fighting the battle. Then I think in a way we moved away from an appreciation and a quest for the text itself and into a more sort of theoretical, dogmatic position. And unfortunately, I think this is the case in much sort of Pentateuchal scholarship. Yes, of course, in a way, from a more faith position, I can see that in the critical camp. But yes, I also need to admit it is a lot of it in the faith camp as well. And at least my view is, if I really believe that the word is what it's claiming to be, I can approach it quite openly. I don't. It can defend itself, but of course, your conclusions matters. It matters for how you, in a way, how you end in a faith position. It is so, as I'm saying, sort of, we need to be cautious and hold back faith, so it doesn't become dogmatic in the sense of us not being open to, in with the real questions and the text as we have it. But I think also, so in that sense, when a traditional view is criticized for just saying, well, we're just projecting our faith upon the text and reading it, there might be something to it, and we need to listen to that criticism. But personally, I believe it can also be an advantage to come with a faith position to the text. If the text is really what it's claiming to be, it's primarily not calling us to create a theory or a theology, but to respond to the text, to respond to the one speaking to us through the text. And in that sense, there is a strength and an advantage in coming to it from a faith perspective. So I think in a way we just need to be open and honest and self-searching. In a way, what is really driving us when we enter into a discussion? What is our motivation? What is really driving me in my study of the text? Yeah, and I think also sort of being generous to each other. In a way, we're coming from a lot of different perspectives. I can learn a lot from listening to a critical scholar. There are sort of, even if I'm not following the flow of or the direction of the argument and the conclusions, still in a way listening into can be, you can learn a lot. And I think in a way meeting each other more in that generosity, I think would help Pentateuchal scholarship a lot. So.
Yes, I agree. So I noticed that if somebody doesn't accept four sources, JEPD, it's almost same as if he's not a scholar at all. So that's some dogma. And also traditionalists sometimes would say they're unfaithful, and I don't like those labels. So can you just tell us what is the eternal evidence and what texts say about authorship and dating? Because we see things that Moses certainly wrote if we believe the text. For example, some laws, songs, and wars. But on the other hand, we have some later comments and things. So can you say what text from the Torah says about its authorship?
Yeah, so as you're mentioning, the Pentateuch itself mentions that Moses wrote. So he was a composer or literary author. Joshua was also, in a way, if we just include Joshua as well in this, it says also he was writing down the Pentateuch. I think that's significant evidence, at least from internal evidence in the text itself. The first time Moses is mentioned as writing is in Exodus 17, verse 14. He writes down the Book of the Covenant. In Deuteronomy, you have the three speeches in the first person of Moses, and we're presenting as if he is the one speaking. So I think in a way there are several places in the Pentateuch where Moses is presented as the author, and it is relatively clear what sections are being written down. Then the question is, well, what about all the material in between that are more anonymous, or the book of Genesis, which is an anonymous composition? I know there are with believers that react when you say that it's anonymous, but it's basically stating a bare fact. Nowhere in the book of Genesis do we have any mention of an author. So it's just stating the fact. When we say it, it is anonymous, and this, to me, this is where it many of the questions arise in how do we deal with those sections where it is more anonymous. Was that in a way still composed by Moses? Was it Joshua that put it together and we compiled some of this? Could it have been put together at a later stage? So, for example, in Deuteronomy, you have all the major sections with speeches being presented as from Moses, or the mouth of Moses. But then, in a way, you have these transitions in between it seems to be sort of more an anonymous composition, or it is an anonymous composition. I think it would be interesting also to explore further sort of the use of first and third person in ancient Near Eastern compositions, because I think there is evidence both in biblical material and extra biblical material that authors could refer to themselves both in the first person and the third person. So, and in a way, as a teacher, I'm seeing the students doing that frequently. In a way, they write a student paper and then refer to themselves in the third person. This researcher does this and this. So in a way, in the academic genre, we do that type of thing all the time. And I think there is evidence in the ancient Near East that ancient authors also did the same. And I think it would be interesting to explore that further. What are the implications of this? We know that in sort of poetic, prophetic compositions, you have person number gen shifts frequently. And it's quite difficult to explain all of that as different sources. So I think in a way, exploring that more could be interesting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth. So just a quick question. You mentioned that Joshua wrote something by the text itself. So were you referring to the Joshua 24:26, where it says, Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. So what the text says here, is it that text that you're referring?
And I would need to just look it up again, but it's this text, and I think you have some other texts also sort of indicating that he's writing the book of the law. Of course, what portion? That's the question. This is a stele he's writing. We know that was a well-known tradition in the ancient Near East to set up a stele to create a memorial stone that, in a way, would be for ages to come. So he seems, in a way, to want to create a permanent sort of composition that can be a memorial stone for the people. But I haven't studied myself how much, or what is the in way, how much can we say on the basis of Joshua about Joshua's role. But at least in a way, I think this is the type of evidence that should be taken into consideration. As scholars, we cannot just pick and choose what evidence we want to relate to. As I said, sort of a first step has to be a close reading of the claims of the text itself. And then in a way you need to start from there.
All right. So in the beginning of our interview, you pointed out that features often taken as a signs of compositional layers in the Pentateuch are also found in other ancient Near Eastern texts, including Ugaritic ones. Can you give us examples of those?
Yeah. In a way, this is a conference or a topic I had a presentation on together with one of my students for the Celle. Where we used the matriarchs in danger narratives in Genesis as in where the test case. You have Abram in Genesis 12 giving away Sarah. For some reason, he does the same in Genesis 20. And then in Genesis 26, Isaac gives away Rebecca. So in where you have three quite similar stories, but at the same time different. So in a way, the literary feature that, in a way, as an example, would be this repetition with variation as a literary feature that we see in Pentateuchal or the Pentateuchal texts. And traditionally, Genesis 12 and 26 have been perceived as a Yahwist source, Genesis 20 as an Elohist source. So in a way, they come from different sources, because scholars have found it strange that why do you write similar stories? In a way, it is limits to how many mistakes the same family can do. In a way, they should have learned. Because of the parallels, they have to be different sources. And this is sort of what we're exploring. I think it is very clear in where you have the repetitive pattern, for example, in Genesis 1, day 1, day 2, day 3, and similar formulas. But again, as Gary Rensburg has shown, it's similar formulas, but still variation between them. Hebrew authors disliked just to copy-paste the same material. So usually it's some kind of a variation as well when they're repeating. So you find this type of repetition with variation on smaller scale, and then in a way on larger scale as well. And I think if you go to the Gilgamesh epic, for example, is Scott Nogel. He's been exploring repetition with variation in the Gilgamesh epic. Amnon Altman and Joshua Berman, they've explored this repetition with variation in Suppiluliuma's, the first treaty, a Hittite treatise, where in a way he tells the same story different times, and he changes it. So we would say in a way, well, he's lying. He knows very well that it is a different version, and it's clearly differences between or incoherence, as we would call it, between the different stories. You find the same in the Baal cycle, the Ugaritic Baal cycle. Gary Rensburg has explored this phenomena in the Shipwrecked Sailor, sort of repetition with variation. recently I was also looking into Homer's Iliad, and again, in a way, you find the same phenomena. So it's just again and again you find this phenomena of repetition with variation, and this has been used as an argument that it has to be different sources, because in a way, yeah, it's inconsistencies. And but if you find the phenomena spread over all the ancient Near East, I think, and it seems to be an intentional literary technique, I think in a way that speaks in favor of also considering it as an intentional literary technique in the Pentateuch. So when biblical authors use this, it's not primitive literature or incompetent editors that were not able to sort of merge the material properly, but it has a literary purpose, and we need to be sensitive to that. As I mentioned earlier, sort of our literary standard is very much from Aristotle and in with the Western tradition of text. But we just need to realize that these texts are older and written in a literary environment that had other literary values and standards than we are having today. So in a way, what they would perceive as a coherent text might be very different from what we perceived as coherent text, because we're looking at different things. And that type of thing, in a way, I think is sort of a path to exploring these phenomena in the text in different ways that I think will be more productive than just simply chopping them up in different sources and say, well, we've done it. Now we've created a text that is coherent to our standards. It fits more how we like to see narratives. Yeah, no, we're dealing with ancient texts that are very different.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Kenneth. And you mentioned Homer. I asked this Edwin Yamuchi, a great scholar, so he said something else on this point. A quote, in the case of Homer, for example, he lived in the 8th century BC. He preserved accurate information from the Mycenaean age before 1200s BC. So even if we take a later time for composition of the Pentateuch, it also still can be accurate preservation. And yeah, would you agree with him?
Yeah, of course, here we come, I come from Scandinavia. And of course, the Scandinavian school is very much is well known for, in its tradition approach, that there were early oral traditions that were written down at a later point. So Sigmund Mowinckel and scholars following him. I've sort of I haven't done much on sort of oral theory, but in my studies of literary reuse and literary parallels, I do think we sometimes are dealing with cases where a biblical author is quoting a passage not as we would today, in a way just sitting with the text in front and in a way copying word for word, but they are copying from memory, and sort of they had much of the text in their head, and sort of when we see differences, this relates to, in a way, repetition with variation, but and biblical authors not wanting just to in a way copy paste the material. They usually, when they, even if they in a way wrote from memory, they could have produced it correctly, but maybe they didn't want to, because it's a literary point, it's an ethical point, it's a spiritual point. in the slight modifications they are making. I think we see that with Jesus in the New Testament also, Paul. Is it because they don't know the texts that they slightly vary from the source text? Now, usually it is in the variation that some of the significant points are communicated. This would be something similar to Joshua Berman's argument in relation to the Hittite prologue treatise. When Suppiluliuma retells the story, is not because he doesn't know it. It's not because the audience doesn't know it, but based on the Amarna letters, the theory is that they were trying to give signals in that in the variations, and so it's sometimes in the variations that the author is communicating the most important points. But so I think in a way studies have been done that show clearly that oral cultures can have an extreme ability to reproduce exact texts or exact narratives. So if we in the modern AI age struggle to remember things and we immediately need to check it online to make sure, we shouldn't assume that people living in a very different culture didn't have far better abilities to memorize text. So if you've grown up memorizing text, you're trained in it in a very different way. And studies have shown in a way that exact reproduction is possible in oral cultures. But in a way, the little study I've done also, I think sometimes it is difficult to prove that the written material is based on oral. I think in a way there are some evidence of more orality versus sort of written compositions. Susan Needich, in a way, she's writing about this, and I think in a way, it's while some scholars have taken an either-or position, sort of either orality or written. She says, well, let's rather look at it along a continuum. So it's more or less elements of orality and the written. I think in a way that's the better approach, that we can say, well, here we can see more oral elements in the text, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily say the entire composition was orally composed first. That reason. So yeah.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you so much again. So next question, you wrote the chapter Memorized Covenantal Instruction and Legal Reuse in the Torah. In it, you respond to the common criticism that the Torah's legal corpora contain contradictions and inconsistencies. So could you explain how your model addresses this issue and why you argue that the Torah should be understood not primarily as a law code in the modern sense, but as a covenantal instruction?
Of course, in a way, you have two questions there. The one is about how to deal with contradiction and coherence, and the other is about, in a way, how to characterize Torah. And as you say, I suggest we should see it as covenantal instruction. In a way, beginning with the last, why see it as covenantal instruction? First of all, it's quite sort of consensus in scholarship now in ancient Near Eastern law codes that they were not law codes, but more collections for other purposes than law codes. So that's in a way sort of a consensus. We've had the modern idea of law, and we've read that back into these texts and thought that, well, they function as the Constitution of Hammurabi or something like that. And it seems like in way in the ancient Near East, they had a different function. So it's not controversial to say that no, they are not law codes as such. But then the question is, well, how do you then characterize it? And when I'm suggesting and we're seeing it as covenantal instruction, first of all, of course, these are terms taken from Berit, covenant, and Torah, instruction. So in a way, I try to use terminology in the text itself to try to characterize it. But in a way, one reason for not seeing it as a law code is, for example, in the instructions given to the judges. So nowhere in the instructions to the judges are they instructed to judge according to Torah, as we would expect. In a modern law court, you have the legal text, and it's the legal text that you are judged on the basis of. The Israelite judges were instructed to judge according to righteousness, tzedek, which is a different type of concept. Did they know Torah? Yeah, I think in a way they knew it pretty well. So it's not that Torah is not playing a role in the legal setting, but it wasn't the text that was the final reference in Israelite jurisprudence. But at several places we see that the ultimate reference was Yahweh, was God himself. So in the 4 court cases mentioned in the Pentateuch, in all of them, they need to consult the prophet. And why the prophet? Well, the prophet is the spokesperson for Yahweh. So God is the ultimate reference in the law. And then, of course, sort of, then I think still it is clear that the text was meant to be normative. So among scholars nowadays on ancient Near Eastern law collections, they say, well, some of these law collections were just school practices, for example. It was just scribes practicing, and they were used as sort of scribal exercise texts. Or they had a more monumental function. And I think in a way it is clear that the Pentateuch was meant to have not just, it wasn't meant only as a school exercise for Joshua sitting there to have something to write. That was not the point. It was neither for him to just write it on a stele. That was neither the point. It was clearly meant to be a normative text. So, and I think it becomes very clear when we come to the prophets sort of criticizing the people on the basis of the law. You haven't lived according to it. Yeah. So in a way, these are some of the reasons why I think in a way describing it more as covenantal instruction is, at least it's a proposal. If for those interested in my full argument, it's in the first chapter of my book, Reading as a Disclosure, The Thoughts of the Heart. But then you also asked this about coherence and contradiction. And in a way, my background is philosophy. That's my sort of original training. And of course, when you start philosophy training, one of the basic principles is the law of non-contradiction. So if A, then if you have A, then you cannot have non-A at the same time. So that is, it's a non-contradiction, or it is a contradiction. And Aristotle, as I said earlier, sort of he also established this as one of the basic principles of philosophy. So, and I was also early in my 20s, I was very fascinated by sort of a more apologetic approach to the Bible and Christian thinking. And of course, they're also Christian apologists use very much the principle of non-contradiction in a way as a basic principle in their argumentation. So to me, it was interesting beginning to explore and see that, well, biblical authors don't seem to be as concerned about contradiction as we are. This said, I should maybe add that in Pentateuch scholarship, scholars often talk about contradiction in the text, which doesn't really qualify according at least to the philosophical principle of what is actually a contradiction. So A and non-A. Usually what is called contradiction is strictly more incoherence, is differences, variation that we find difficult to see coherence between. So I think in the Pentateuch, in most cases, it's better to speak about coherence than contradiction. But then sort of exploring more the ancient Near East, and then several places, I think we see what we would call contradiction. So it was it Heinrich Schäfer and Bruno Trout that in a way laid out the principles of Egyptian art. So in a way, when we look at Egyptian art, it looks very, very strange, very unusual to how we think about text. And I think in a way the comparison is interesting because the Pentateuch itself aligns itself very much with an Egyptian background. So in a way, comparing them with Egyptian art. So what I usually do with my students is I ask them to stand up and then imitate an Egyptian figure. So we've all seen these figures. You see the person from the side or the face from the side. But when you come to the shoulders, you see the shoulders from the front. When you come to the hips and legs, you see the hips and legs from the side again. And of course, anyone can try to stand in a position like that. It's just anatomically, at least very uncomfortable to stand this way. And it's not a normal sort of naturalistic representation of the human body. Because as Bruno Trout and Schäfer show, that was not the point in Egyptian art. When we come to Greek and Roman art, sort of a more naturalistic portrayal is much more appealing. So we go to the museums in Rome, in Greece, and we're impressed by the anatomy and all that. But this is reflecting sort of a certain ideal. For the Egyptians, they didn't have that ideal. In Egyptian art, as Bruno Trout says, art is more aspectual. So the point when you're going to portray a certain feature is that you try to capture the essential character of that feature. So with a face, what is the most characteristic of our face? Is it to see it from the front or from the side? No, it's from the side. There's where you see the profile better. Our shoulders, are they most characteristic from the front or from the side? Of course, it's from the front. Our hips and legs, are they most characteristic from the front, from the side? From the side. So that's in a way why they're not concerned about seeing it as a whole, but to capture the essence of each element. And you see that in their architecture as well. To us, sometimes it looks like childish paintings. But it's just with a different logic behind the composition. I think also we see the same with the Mesopotamian Lamassu, with the composite beings with 5 legs. If you stand in front and look at them from the front, they just have 2 front legs. You don't see any other legs. If you stand from the side, you see 4 legs. But if you stand at an angle, you see that the figure actually has 5 legs. And of course, to us, that's just, yeah, it's biologically absurd to portray a figure that way. But the point is, in what they were thinking of, from what perspective or aspect are you looking at the figure? So this also about, in a way, composite beings. Connie Gain wrote her dissertation on what's called the Mishwesen in sort of Mesopotamian or Neo-Assyrian art, where she's seeing that sort of these middle figures of divine figures in the divine pantheon, they were often portrayed as composite beings. So, where they had maybe a piece of this animal and a piece of this animal, and maybe a human feature. And that these were, well, the top gods, the prime gods, they were not portrayed this way. And I've been speculating, and this is where I'm speculating. But when we come to the Pentateuch, scholars have shown that the Pentateuch is a composite text like no other text in the ancient Near East. You have legal texts like the laws of Hammurabi, the laws of Ishtar. You have ritual texts, because you have prophetic texts. But in a way, this merging of all of it into the same composition is really unique in the ancient Near East. And to me, it's a question in a way, why is that done? At least in the text as we have it, it is clear this is done. It is intentional, sort of somebody has put all of this intentionally together. And I'm in a way wondering whether it is some of the same sort of compositional techniques of shifting perspectives based on what you want to portray, or even the idea that our language, human conception is limited. Again, sort of philosophy, thinking of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, in a way, with the limitations of our human language. And in our limitations as humans to perceive God, the biblical solution was to shift and see God from different perspectives, different angles. So I'm tempted to say almost like a painting of Picasso. When you look at Picasso, you see in all these different perspectives. And so Cubism in modern art has some of the similar features as some of the ancient art. And I think in a way we can see similarities also to the composition of the Pentateuch. Of course, many have also used the music metaphor. So when Beethoven or Bach compose music, they have variation over a theme. And this repetition with variation is well known in music, and we appreciate very much in music. And maybe we should start appreciating it a bit more in biblical studies as well.
Wow, that's super helpful. Thank you, Dr. Bergland. We are running out of time, so let's try to cover just, I think, 3 questions. So you wrote the article Jeremiah 34, originally composed as a legal blend of Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15. So if Jeremiah 34 presupposes both P and D sources as already existing, does this not pose a serious challenge to those who will date the priestly and Deuteronomistic material as late as the Babylonian or even Persian periods? How do you see your findings affecting the broader debate about the dating of these sources?
Yeah, yeah. In my article there, I'm arguing that the author of Jeremiah 34 had both what I would call Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15, available in and incorporated them, reused them in the original composition. I think it is an important thing to notice is that when we're dealing with literary reuse and direction of dependence, we can only establish relative chronology, not absolute chronology. So we can talk about which of the texts come before the other, but it doesn't necessarily give us an absolute dating of when the texts were written. It gives us a relative order of them. So, for example, a scholar like Bernard Levinson, he would also see both of these texts as part of the original composition of Jeremiah 34. But since he dates what he calls the DNP to the post-exilic period, or sort of a later period, he makes this as an argument that it means that Jeremiah 34 has to be even later. You see, so and the study of direction of dependence and literary reuse again cannot give us more than the relative order in it. So we need something else to establish the more absolute dating of the texts. But at least in my mind, sort of as I argue also, I don't see any evidence in that text that it was sort of it is transitional biblical Hebrew. It's written in the sort of in the right before the exile there. So at least according to diachronic linguistics, this is where the book of Jeremiah belongs in that period. It doesn't belong to post-exilic Hebrew. And as I said earlier, Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15, according to diachronic linguistics, it belongs to classical biblical Hebrew. It's pre-exilic also. So this is where I would disagree with Bernard Levinson. I agree with the order he comes up with, and I think I've in a way explored it further. But when we talk about the more dating of the texts, I think in a way he ignores too much diachronic linguistics, and diachronic linguistics will push the dating of Jeremiah 34 to a more transitional or sort of right before the exile, which would mean that Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15 has to be even earlier than this. So in a way, that's how I would deal with that type of question. And but of course, Jeremiah 34 was, as it has been called, the Archimedean point for Wellhausen's theory. This is why I found it interesting to explore Jeremiah 34. This is where he comes up with a relationship between Torah and the prophets, and in which showing that actually another reading of this is more substantial and better. I think at least shakes a bit in Wellhausen's theory. So.
Incredible. So, can you give us examples? How do you know that Jeremiah is referring to Leviticus and Deuteronomy and those chapters? Just quickly, and also tell us more about debate regarding the priority of the Torah versus the priority of the prophets. Do the differences that appear among the prophets when they quote the Pentateuch compared to the text of the Pentateuch itself indicate that the Torah didn't exist in its final form at that time, and that only certain traditions and sources circulated, so that the Pentateuch was composed after the prophetic books? Or can these differences be interpreted in another way?
So, in the study of literary reuse, first, in a way, I think you need to establish that it actually is reuse, literary reuse between the texts. So this would be seeing, is there significant repetition of lexemes, phrases? I think one of the stronger arguments is in a way seeing unique phrases It's only between these two passages that you actually have these words. But it's several arguments in a way for establishing reuse. When you've established reuse, then you look at, well, a different set of criteria or indicators to establish the direction of dependence. And here, for example, you would take a look at is one of the texts in the parallels you established referring to a source for its material. So as it is written, for example, would be an indicator that this source is depending on another source. And I think in Jeremiah 34, verse 14, 12 or 14, I think, 12, 14, you clearly have that sort of indicator that Jeremiah 34 is the one borrowing. But again, it's a more complicated argument. So sort of anyone are welcome to read more of the details of the argument. Of course, sort of to move to your second question, it was Wellhausen that argued strongly that it was the prophets that came first and Torah came after. He was a romantic with the idea of originality. So the prophets are the energetic, they are the geniuses, they are the original thinkers. And when you come to the sort of legal material, priestly material, or cultic material, it's just dull, it's boring. And this, of course, in a way, Wellhausen also had this anti-Semitic, in a way, elements in his theory. And so degrading a later stage of Judaism. So that was sort of foundational in his approach. But then I think in my study of Jeremiah 34, I know John Bergsma is coming with an article now in our new volume, Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch, showing in a way that we do find evidence that prophets knew of several portions of the Pentateuch and put them together, amalgamated them. Which is sort of, so when Jeremiah 34, for example, both uses from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it's an indication that at least in what portions of those texts were available during the composition of Jeremiah 34. Because I think it's also important to remember that biblical authors did not have the concept of canon as we do today. For them, it was more sort of fluid texts here and there, gradually being compiled together to what we now know as the canon. So we shouldn't expect biblical authors to reflect the idea of a canon as we know it. But when we find evidence that biblical authors are using both from here and there, it is an indication that they were familiar with larger portions of the Hebrew Bible as we know it. And again, in where that's maybe as far as we can go with the argument.
Right. So, okay. Last question, Professor Bergland. What challenges exist for your model of a positive approach to understanding the composition of the Pentateuch? What are the most recent unresolved questions and difficult issues that we don't yet have answers to, or the arguments that at first glance sound convincing from proponents of the documentary hypothesis and source criticism? And after that, please give us some conclusions. And yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll just quote the Talmud, teach my tongue to say, I do not know. And I think this is a challenge for all of us in scholarship. In a way, we want to be more confident and clear than the evidence often gives us a basis for. So I think in a way this practice of also admitting that it is a lot of things we don't know, and being open on that. I mentioned earlier this is also about sort of not allowing dogmatism to rule our reflection and academic work. Let the text speak for itself. Let's discuss it openly and yeah, and generously with each other. You ask about sort of areas where it's still need of more studies. I think I've indicated sort of the concept of literary coherence needs more study. I think it is a need for more rigor and accountability in the study of literary reuse and direction of dependence. It's too loose often, the argumentations being proposed. I mentioned comparative studies, and the importance of empirical models. I think that needs to be explored more with also a cautionary and moderate, in a way, approach where we don't move faster than the evidence actually takes us. I think also the question of different stages in the diachrony of classical biblical Hebrew is interesting. Sort of, are we seeing different layers of what earlier has been just lumped together as classical biblical Hebrew? So, and I think that's important for Torah because it comes clearly at the earliest of that stage. And I think in a way, a closer attention to the literary profile of the Pentateuch itself. We've been working with some British scholars, Alexander Samley, Philip Alexander, and I think in a way, exploring more the literary profile of the Pentateuch can be beneficial as well. You mentioned something about concluding, or I'm not sure what you.
So, any advice for people that are interested in this topic, and what would you say to them?
I think in way, just repeating a bit what I said before, in way being moderate, being careful, but also being willing to evaluate all theories in light of the text, in a way that we try to avoid the dogmatism and the fighting, and in a way that we can be generous towards each other, but also that the secondary literature now on the Pentateuch is just overwhelming. It's a flooding every year. It's published massive volumes of material. And of course, if you want to get into studying the Pentateuch, it's good to get an overview, but don't get lost in all the secondary literature. And we get to the text, read the text closely, get to the primary sources in the ancient Near East, read those closely, and in a way see where it takes you. But also, I think in a way, a last point is that also ask yourself, what is driving me in my studies? What is really my motivation? Is it to serve God and to serve other people? Is that my motivation? Or am I just trying to come up with an original theory to build my career, or something else? Because I think in a way, reflecting on our motivations for the study is healthy and good. And of course, I think the text is very clear what our primary motivations should be, sort of loving the Lord our God with all our heart and our neighbor as ourselves. And I think in that spirit, reading the text in that spirit, and wanting to explore openly in that spirit, I think it will be a blessing for yourself and for many others. So, yeah.
Dr. Bergland, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been a real privilege to have you with us from the other side of the world. So, to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow NT Podcast for more conversations on biblical scholarship, theology, and ancient history. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring. Goodbye.